The Lycan King had not bowed to anyone in 300 years. Not to rival kings. Not to ancient elders. Not to the councils that governed wolf territories across 4 continents. Councils that had tried, more than once, to bring him to heel. He had not bowed. Until the night a barefoot Omega girl walked into the center of his war circle with blood on her hands and said, in a voice so quiet it should not have carried, "You will stop this. Now." And he did. The entire war circle went silent. 200 Lycan soldiers, the most feared fighters in the known wolf world, every single one of them frozen. Not because of an order, not because of a weapon, because of her. Because of what poured off her in that moment. Something ancient, something that had no name in the modern wolf language, something that reached into the deep animal part of every wolf present and said with absolute certainty, "This is authority. This is real. This is the thing you have been bowing toward all along without knowing it." Her name was Nara Osk. She was 23 years old. She had been called weak her entire life. And she was about to change everything. If you are the kind of person who roots for the ones everyone counted out, this story was made for you. Like the video, hit that subscribe button right now, and drop in the comments where you are watching from. Someone from your country is already down there. Let's go. Nara Osk was born in Omega. In the Lycan world, that word carried a particular weight. Not the same weight it carried in regular wolf packs. In Lycan society, where physical power was the primary language of respect and the hierarchy was both older and more rigid than anything regular wolves observed, being in Omega wasn't simply a status. It was closer to a verdict. Omegas were the lowest rank, the last to eat, the last to be considered, the first to be handed tasks no one else wanted. In a Lycan pack, an Omega's daily existence was built around a simple, unspoken rule: stay useful, stay quiet, and stay out of the way. Nara had been following that rule since she was old enough to understand it. She was small for a Lycan, another mark against her, in a world where size was read as capability. Her hair was a dark, unremarkable brown that she kept braided tight against her head, because loose hair was a liability when you spent your days doing physical pack work. Her eyes were dark too, almost black in low light. But in certain light, the pale light of early morning, the strange light that came in just before a storm, there was something in them that people noticed and then forgot. The way you notice something at the edge of your vision, and when you turn to look at it directly, it's gone. She lived in the servant quarter of Ashfeld Keep, the primary stronghold of the Lycan High King's territory. A vast, graystone fortress that had stood for 4 centuries in the northernmost tip of the Lycan lands, a place of cold corridors and high walls, and a perpetual faint smell of iron that every keep wolf eventually stopped noticing. She cleaned. She cooked. She carried. She repaired. She cleaned. She cooked. She carried. She repaired. She learned the geography of the keep the way you learn the geography of any place you have no choice but to inhabit, through repetition, through the muscle memory of corridors walked 1,000 times, through the specific, intimate knowledge that comes from being responsible for a space's maintenance. She knew which doors stuck in wet weather. She knew which fireplace in the great hall drew badly when the wind came from the north. She knew the 6 loose stones in the servant quarters floor that clucked underfoot in the small hours of the night, and she had learned to step around each of them without thinking, the way you stop thinking about the obstacles you have learned to navigate. She knew the keep's sounds the way she knew its geography. The bell pattern that meant a formal visitor. The different bell pattern that meant a security alert. The specific quality of silence that settled over the compound in the hour before dawn, when even the night shift guards allowed themselves brief stillness. The distant, rhythmic sound from the upper floors that was Cormith Drev moving through his late-night circuits of the tower. A habit his household staff knew well, that restless movement of a man too driven to sleep easily, who walked when he couldn't rest. She had heard that sound for 6 years without once having a face to put to it that felt real. She was 17 when she came to the keep, brought as part of the territorial tribute that smaller Omega-heavy packs offered to the High King's household every 3 years. Not a slave. The word that humans might have used was not quite accurate in this context. But not free either. Somewhere in the complicated gray space between obligation and captivity that Lycan law had been carefully vague about for a very long time. She had left behind her mother, her younger brother Pell, and a small stone cottage at the edge of their pack's territory that always smelled like wood smoke and dried thyme. She thought about that cottage every single day. The keep was not a cruel place in the obvious, dramatic sense. No one beat the Omegas. No one used overtly degrading language in front of the High King. Cormith Drev had, if nothing else, a strong distaste for overt cruelty that his household staff had learned to match in his presence. But cruelty, as Nara had understood from very early in her life, rarely needed drama. It was more efficient than that. It lived in the way the senior household wolves spoke to her, not unkind, exactly, but with the specific tone reserved for something that is useful but not important. The way a good tool is spoken to. The way a reliable animal is spoken to. It lived in the assignments. Nara was consistently given the heaviest, most isolated, most thankless work in the keep, not because she was bad at other things, but because she was reliably good at all things, and the least visible work was the least valuable work in the keep's social economy, and so it defaulted to the least visible person. It lived in what wasn't said. In 6 years at Ashfeld Keep, not one senior wolf had asked her a question about herself. Not one. She had told herself, in the beginning, that she would keep her head down for long enough to earn some trust, and then she would find a way to send word home, and then eventually she would find a way back. She had revised that plan at year 2 when she understood how thoroughly she had miscalculated the nature of her situation. She had revised it again at year 4 when Pell's letters stopped coming, not abruptly, but with the gradual trailing off of someone who was building a life and finding the space for a sister who was far away and showing no signs of return increasingly hard to hold. She did not blame him. She missed him every day. She was 23 years old and had spent 6 years becoming, by the estimation of everyone who noticed her at all, the most efficiently invisible useful person in Ashfeld Keep. She had also, in those 6 years, been doing something else entirely. Something she had told nobody. Since childhood, Nara had noticed things that other wolves didn't. Not visions, not prophecy, nothing dramatic. Something quieter and more constant. A sensitivity to the emotional weather of any room she entered. A knowledge of when something was wrong before physical evidence appeared. A specific, persistent awareness of the difference between what people said and what they truly meant. At home, her mother had called it being perceptive, gently, as a compliment, and also as a careful warning. You notice things. Be careful about how much you show that. At the keep, she had taken that warning seriously. An Omega who noticed things that ranked wolves had missed was a disruption. And disruptions were managed. So she had noticed things very quietly. She noticed when a senior household wolf skimmed from the kitchen supplies and documented it in a notebook under the loose stone beneath her cot. She noticed when 2 junior war ministry officers met with a messenger carrying Southern Allied pack markers and began paying careful attention to anything those officers touched. She noticed, 2 years after arriving at the keep, a pressure. Specific, directional, persistent, from the direction of the High King's tower. She said nothing about that either. She read everything she could find. And she waited, with the patience of someone who has been invisible long enough that waiting is simply another word for breathing. It started because the keep's library was technically off-limits to household staff. It started because the librarian, an elderly Lycan scholar named Quist, who had gone almost entirely deaf and whose eyesight had been failing for 20 years, had never quite gotten around to enforcing that restriction with any consistency. And it started because Nara, sent to clean the library at age 17 on her very first week at the keep, had pulled a book off the shelf while she waited for the floor to dry, opened it to a random page, and found herself reading about the first Lycans. Not the version of the story they told at pack gatherings. The original version. The one kept in a language that only scholars and very old wolves could read anymore. She could read it. She hadn't known she could until that moment. The characters should have been foreign to her. They were a writing system 300 years out of common use. But looking at the page, she felt the same sensation she had felt as a child when she occasionally touched old objects and felt their history press through her fingertips, warm and insistent. The characters resolved into words. She stood there for a very long time, reading, and then she came back the next week. And the week after that. In 6 years, she had read nearly everything in the restricted section of Ashfeld Keep's library. Not everything. There were texts that even Quist kept locked away, texts whose covers were sealed with old Lycan binding magic that Nara had pressed her hands against more than once and felt vibrating with a pressure she couldn't yet interpret. But nearly everything else. She knew things now that no Omega was supposed to know. She knew the actual history of the Lycan hierarchy, not the self-serving mythology that kept the current power structure in place, but the messy, complicated, sometimes genuinely heroic, and sometimes genuinely terrible actual history of how a race of wolves who had been given extraordinary power had chosen to organize that power and the costs of those choices. She knew the old laws. The original laws, the ones that predated the current system by 2 centuries, the ones that had been quietly superseded and partially erased because they contained provisions that the current High King's bloodline found inconvenient. She knew, in particular, about the Tether. The Tether was one of the original laws. It predated the High Kingship by more than a century, written in the oldest texts in language so formal it barely resembled modern Lycan. The short version, stripped of the formal language, was this. Every High Lycan King was, according to the old law, bound to a tether, a designated wolf whose purpose was not to serve the king, but to ground him. To provide the counterweight that kept power from collapsing into itself. In the old texts, the tether was described not as a subordinate, but as the king's truest equal. The one person whose honest word he was bound by law to receive. The one wolf who could, in extremis, command him to stop. The tether was always chosen by the old bond. Not the mate bond, something older. The Lycan scholars who had written about it in the restricted texts used a word Nara had spent months trying to translate precisely, verith. Her best interpretation was something between anchor and conscience and counterpart. The tether bond was involuntary, like the mate bond. Unlike the mate bond, it didn't announce itself with warmth and recognition. The old text described it as a pressure, a sense of being watched from a specific direction, a persistent and unignorable awareness of another person's presence even at great distances. Nara had been feeling it for 2 years. She had been feeling it, specifically, from the direction of the High King's private tower. Cormath Drev was the 43rd Lycan High King. He was also, by any objective measure, one of the most powerful wolves alive on the continent. In Lycan terms, his power was not in question and never had been. He had assumed the High Kingship at age 26 after the death of his father, had consolidated his authority over the fractious Lycan territories in less than 4 years, and had maintained that authority for the 11 years since through a combination of genuine capability, strategic intelligence, and an instinctive understanding of force that meant he rarely needed to use it dramatically because his restraint itself was. The demonstration. His father had not been like that. His father, the 42nd High King, had been a man who understood power primarily as a performance. The display of authority. The theatrical function of dominance. He had been good at it, commanding, imposing, feared in the specific way that demands absolute compliance and receives it while producing, underneath the compliance, a corrosive resentment that takes a generation to surface. When he died, suddenly, a hunting accident in the northern forest, The kind of accident that powerful wolves in politically complex environments sometimes had. Cormac had inherited both the kingship and the accumulated resentment. He had spent 4 years dealing with the resentment. He had been, as a result, harder than he wanted to be, more uncompromising than the situation perhaps required, constructing the particular architecture of controlled invulnerability that was the adaptation of a young, newly powerful man who understood that any softness in his exterior would be treated as a structural weakness by the people who had spent his father's reign waiting for exactly that. He was 37 years old, dark-eyed and tall in the extreme Lycan way, with a stillness about him that the wolves closest to him knew was not peace. It was the specific stillness of a man carrying a weight that has been slowly, steadily, increasing for a long time without relief. He had no tether. He had told himself he didn't need one. He was very, very tired. 3 years into his rule, the tether tradition had been raised by his head scholar, a formal recommendation, based on research into the old laws, that the High King consider whether the tradition should be formally restored. Cormac had read the scholar's report with characteristic thoroughness and then set it aside with a single-word notation in the margin. Unnecessary. He had not thought about it again. Or he had tried not to. Because the truth he had not allowed himself to examine directly, was that for 2 years, he had been experiencing something he couldn't explain. A pressure from a specific direction within the keep. A persistent and unignorable awareness. A sense, strongest at night, that someone nearby understood something about him that he hadn't told anyone. He had been walking past the library more often than usual. He had told himself it was a change in his regular patrol habit. He was an intelligent man. He knew he was lying to himself. He had not yet decided what to do about that. The night they first spoke directly was not planned by either of them. It was the 3rd week of the 11th month, well past midnight, and Nara was in the library because she couldn't sleep, which happened often, the sight keeping her mind too active and too full to settle easily. And she was sitting on the floor between 2 bookshelves with a text about the original Lycan bond laws open on her knees. She felt him coming before she heard him. The pressure that had been directing itself at her for 2 years sharpened into immediate, localized awareness. She had perhaps 30 seconds of warning before the library door opened. She considered hiding. She was very good at hiding. She decided not to. She stayed exactly where she was, cross-legged on the floor, the book open in her lap, the single reading candle she had allowed herself lit beside her, and waited. He came around the corner of the bookshelf and stopped. Looked at her. She looked back. The Keep's Omega, barefoot on the library floor in the deep of the night, reading from a text in the old restricted script, as if she had every right in the world to be there. A very long silence. That section of the library is restricted to household staff, he said at last. His voice was exactly what she had expected from 2 years of indirect awareness. Low, controlled, the voice of someone who chose words with precision. Yes, she agreed. Another silence. You can read that. He was looking at the text. Not with authority, with something else. Something that recalibrated slightly. Yes. Where did you learn the old script? She thought about how to answer that. There were several versions of the truth available. She chose the most honest one. From reading it. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, in a movement that was probably the most unkinglike thing she had witnessed in 6 years at the Keep, he sat down on the floor with his back against the opposite bookshelf and looked at the text she was holding from across the narrow aisle. What are you reading? The original formulation of the Tether law, she said, watching him carefully. The section that deals with identification. Silence. He went very still. What does it say? His voice was even. Too even. It says, Nara told him, that the tether bond doesn't feel like the mate bond. It describes it as a pressure from a specific direction, a sense of persistent awareness, an inability to ignore a particular presence, a pause. It also says it's involuntary, and that trying to ignore it has historically been unsuccessful. The silence that followed was the longest yet. "How long?" he asked at last. 2 years, she said. 2 years. He closed his eyes briefly. "For me as well." Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You're an Omega," he said, and the words were not cruel. They were not the social weapon the word often was, but they were the statement of a man working through an unexpected reality. "I know what I am," she said very calmly. He looked at her, and for the first time, Nara felt the full weight of his attention, not the passing notice of a high-ranking wolf acknowledging a low-ranking one, but the sustained, serious attention of a man looking at another person and genuinely trying to understand what he was seeing. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask. Do you know what the tether was originally for?" "Not the ceremonial version. The original function. To ground the High King," he said, reciting it with the slight flatness of someone who has read a document once and retained it, but not thought much about it since. "No," she said. "That's the polite version. The original text is more specific." She turned the book and held it toward him. He leaned forward slightly, read the passage she was indicating. His expression shifted. The original text, which Nara had spent 3 weeks translating with full precision, said, "The tether is not the king's comfort. The tether is the king's correction. They are bound not to ease his power, but to limit it, to stand between the fullness of Lycan authority and its capacity for destruction, to say the word that stops the flood." He sat back. A long, quiet breath. "That's not what the court scholar's summary said." "No," Nara agreed. "It isn't." They met in the library again the following week. And the week after that. It was not romantic. Not immediately, not obviously, in the way that the most important things rarely are, at first. It was 2 people in a room with books, talking. But the texture of those conversations was unlike anything Nara had experienced in 6 years of Keep life, and she suspected, from the way Cormath approached them, with a preparation and a carefulness that she eventually recognized as a man who was not used to conversations where he had to think before he spoke, that they were unlike anything he had experienced in considerably longer. The first 3 meetings were cautious on both sides. Not dishonest. Neither of them had the patience for dishonesty, which was, Nara thought, one of the things the tether bond recognized when it chose. But cautious. Both of them reading the situation carefully. Both of them bringing the particular wariness of people who had been in their respective positions long enough to know how badly conversations could go wrong when the power differential was as stark as theirs. He was the most powerful Lycan alive. She scrubbed his floors. They both held that truth between them without trying to paper over it, which was, she thought, how they managed to eventually stop being cautious with each other. In the 4th meeting, she told him what she actually thought about the Northern dispute strategy. Not diplomatically. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not the response she had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for the particular discomfort of a powerful man whose analysis is challenged, the tightening, the slight shift toward authority, the subtle repositioning that said, "I am tolerating this," not welcoming it. Instead, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, "What specifically is wrong with the eastern boundary redrawn in the 3rd year of my father's reign?" And she told him, and he listened. And they were there until the library's pre-dawn quiet was broken by the distant sound of the morning kitchen staff beginning their work, and both of them looked up at the same moment at the gray light beginning to fill the high windows, and there was a brief, wordless acknowledgement between them. 2 people who have talked through a night and are mildly astonished to find it's morning, before they both, without discussion, stood up and went their separate ways. He asked her questions. Real questions. The kind no one at the keep had ever asked her. Where had she grown up? What her pack had been like? What she had understood about herself before she came to the keep, and what had changed since. He asked about her translation process, not as a test of her capabilities, but with genuine interest in how she had approached the problem of a dead script, and she found herself explaining it in more depth than she had ever explained anything. The way you explain things to someone who is actually listening. She asked him questions in return. Carefully at first, then less so. She asked him about the war. There was always a war in Lycan politics, or the threat of one. In the current case, it was the Northern Dispute, a territorial conflict with a faction of Lycan clans who occupied the high northern reaches of the continent and who had been challenging the High Kingship's territorial claims for 3 years. Not openly, not yet. But the escalation had been steady, and the court war commanders had been preparing a campaign that Cormith was clearly on the verge of authorizing. "How many casualties do your commanders estimate?" she asked one night. He told her the numbers. She was quiet for a moment. "And the Northern clan's position? Have you had their actual position explained to you directly, or only through intermediaries who have an interest in the conflict continuing?" A very long pause. "The latter," he said slowly. "Primarily the latter. There's a clan elder from the Northern faction," she said. "Bresset Moore. He was here at the keep 4 years ago for the Winter Council. I cleaned the guest wing during his stay." A pause. "He was not a man who wanted war. He was a man who wanted his clan's old grazing rights acknowledged. He had letters with him. I saw them on his writing desk when I changed the linens. Letters to his family. He talked about a specific valley his clan had used for 3 generations that had been reclassified under the new territorial mapping. That is what he came here to discuss." Cormith was looking at her. "What was the outcome of his visit?" "He was received by your third minister. Not by you." The meeting lasted 40 minutes. He left the day after with the same expression he arrived with. A man who has been told that his concern is being considered and knows it isn't. Silence. "You cleaned the guest wing," he said carefully. "You changed his linens." "I am very good at my job," Nara said without edge. "And omegas are invisible. He wrote his letters in full view, because I was not someone worth altering his behavior for." Cormith was quiet for a long time after that. He recalled Bresset Moore. Specifically requested the elder's attendance at the keep for a private audience. His court was confused. The Northern Dispute had been trending toward military resolution. The war campaign was nearly authorized, and a private audience with a Northern clan elder was not in any current strategy. Darrow, his head of war, a formidable Lycan who had served under both Cormith and his father, and who was genuinely loyal and genuinely good at his job, and genuinely wrong about this particular situation, came to Cormith's study looking puzzled. "The recall is strategically unusual," he said, with the diplomatic caution of a man who wanted to say this is not what we planned. "I know," Cormith said. "Do it anyway." The audience with Bresset Moore took place on a morning in early winter, in the small private meeting room that the keep used for conversations that were not for official record. Cormith met him alone. No ministers, no advisors, no court strategists who had spent 3 years modeling this conflict as a necessary military engagement. Bresset Moore was a man of late middle age, built in the dense way of the mountain clans, with cautious eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has been disappointed by powerful people enough times that hope had become a luxury he could no longer afford. He spent the first 20 minutes being very careful. He used the diplomatic language of a man who had learned, through experience, that the wrong word in the wrong room produced consequences that followed you home. He spoke about the territory dispute in the careful, measured language of official grievance, respectful, formal, emptied of the personal weight that the official language was designed to filter out. Cormith let him be careful, and then he leaned forward slightly and said, "Tell me about the valley." The shift in the old elder's face was extraordinary. Not immediate. There was a beat of pure wariness first, the flinch of a man who has been caught off guard and is assessing whether this is a trap. And then something else moved through it. The careful, diplomatic face cracked, slightly, around a grief that was apparently still very close to the surface. He talked for an hour. About the valley, not just as territory, but as what territory means to a clan that has used it for 3 generations. The specific kind of meaning that is not recorded in boundary maps or territorial charters, The kind that lives in the knowledge of where your grandfather was buried, and where the first snowmelt comes each spring, and where your children learn to run their first shifts. The kind that a remapping exercise, however technically correct in its survey data, destroyed with the casual completeness of something that didn't know what it was destroying because it had never been asked. Cormith listened. He asked questions. Real ones. Bressett Moore left the meeting 3 hours after he arrived, with a provisional agreement to begin the renegotiation process and a direct line of communication to the High King's office. He walked out of the keep with the expression of a man who had come in carrying a weight he had given up expecting to ever put down and was not yet entirely sure he had permission to put it down, but was testing, carefully, whether the ground beneath it would hold. He was a man who wanted his people's valley back. It was such a small thing, and such a large thing, simultaneously, the way the most human griefs always are. The northern dispute was resolved without the war campaign. It took 5 months of careful, unglamorous work. The renegotiation of the territorial mapping, the restoration of traditional grazing rights for several northern clans, the establishment of a direct communication channel between the clan elders and the High King's office that bypassed the third minister layer that had been, whether deliberately or through institutional inertia, filtering and softening communication from the north for years. The court war commanders were disgruntled. Several of them had genuine ideological commitments to the military resolution they had been planning. One of them, a senior commander named Betrayal, was more than disgruntled. Nara felt it before Cormith did. She felt it as a shift in the Tether bond, not a change in her awareness of Cormith, but a change in the quality of the keep's atmosphere, a pressure in the place where her sight touched the keep's collective emotional weather. Something wrong. Something aimed. She went looking for it. She found it in the records hall, 3 days before she was able to interpret it fully. A discrepancy in the communication logs between the keep and the northern territories. Certain messages that had been sent but did not appear in the official record. Certain responses that had been altered before they reached the court ministers. The northern dispute had not been merely mismanaged. It had been deliberately steered toward escalation. The full picture, when she assembled it, was this. Betrayal had been in contact with a southern Lycan faction, a collection of high-ranking wolves who had been positioned to benefit enormously from a northern war, in terms of territorial acquisition and the political realignment that a major military victory would enable. He had been selectively filtering communication between the northern clans and the keep's ministers for 18 months, engineering misunderstanding, creating the impression that peaceful resolution was impossible. She took it to Cormith. She laid it in front of him the way she laid out everything, quietly, completely, without drama. She watched him read it. The stillness he sat in as he read was not the controlled stillness of the man she had met in the library 2 years ago. This was something under pressure, something that was working very hard to stay contained. "How did you find this?" he asked when he reached the end. "The communication logs," she said. "I have access to the records hall, as part of my cleaning duties." He looked up at her. "You found evidence of an 18-month conspiracy against the High King's peace," he said slowly, while cleaning the records hall. "The cleaning was also necessary," she said. The dust accumulation was significant. The look on his face at that moment was one she would hold in her memory for a very long time. Betrayal was arrested, tried, and stripped of his command. The southern faction he had been working with was exposed, not all at once, which would have been strategically unwise, but carefully, one connection at a time, in the methodical way that Cormith moved through problems when he had the full picture in front of him. Nara was present for none of the formal proceedings. She was an Omega household worker. There was no official mechanism for her to be present. But Cormith called her to his study privately on the evening after Betrayal's trial concluded, and he told her how it had gone, in the same direct way he had been telling her things for 2 years now. And she listened, in the way she had always listened, fully, without the performance of listening that people in positions of authority often received, but the actual thing. You saved a significant number of lives, he said. The northern clans. Vrail's target list for post-war acquisition included their main settlement. You made the decisions, she said. I found some documents. You found the documents, he said carefully, because you have spent 6 years being invisible in the exact places where the most important information lies, because an entire system decided you were not worth noticing, and you used that to understand the truth of this keep better than any of my court officials. A pause. You also translated the Tether law, he said, and told me what it actually meant, which changed the way I've been thinking about the next 8 years of my kingship more than anything else in recent memory. Nara looked at him steadily. What are you trying to say? She asked. I'm trying to say that I have been circling something for 2 years, he said, and I would like to stop circling it. Silence. The tether bond between them was a steady, warm pressure. Nothing like the discomfort she had initially associated with it, that persistent, unignorable awareness that it felt, at first, like something to be managed. It had become, over 2 years, something she recognized as essential. The way you recognize that a specific sound you've been hearing for so long you stop noticing it is not background noise. It is something load-bearing, something structural. Say what you mean, she told him. He looked at her for a moment. And then he did something she had not expected. He said exactly what he meant. He told her that the tether bond, as she had translated it, was not simply a political or metaphysical function, that the original texts, including the ones she hadn't yet gotten to in the deeper restricted section, were explicit about its personal dimension. That the reason the tether tradition had been progressively formalized and eventually dropped from practice was not because it was ineffective, but because it was, in the long run, inconvenient for the kind of kingship that wanted no counterweight, no honest voice, no person who was bound by old law to say the word that stopped the flood. He told her that 2 years ago, before he understood what the bond was, he had still noticed her. Not in the distant, peripheral way that high-ranking wolves noticed omegas, as category, as function, as background element. Specifically, the way you notice a note in music that is quiet but that, if you removed it, you would hear the absence of immediately. He told her that knowing what the bond was had not created that. It had only named it. Nara was very quiet for a long time. I am an omega, she said at last. The court will not accept it. I know. Your council will argue against it. Some of them will do more than argue. I know. The existing power structure within the keep has been built, in part, on the assumption that people like me don't matter. Formalizing any other position for me will create enemies you don't currently have. I know that too. He held her gaze. Are those reasons you believe, or reasons you're offering me as an exit? A long pause. She thought about the stone cottage that smelled like wood smoke and dried time. The mother who had raised her to be capable and quiet and careful in a world that wasn't built for her. The 6 years of doing excellent work in rooms full of people who looked through her. The library and old Quist's compromised eyesight, and the night she had opened a book in a dead script and felt the characters resolve into meaning as if something was waiting for her to find them. She thought about what it had felt like the first time Cormith had sat down on the library floor and asked her a real question. Neither, she said finally. They're things that are true, that you should think about carefully, because they will happen. A pause. They're not reasons for a decision I haven't made yet. He looked at her. Are you close to making it? I'm working through it, she said. Give me time. Time, in the keep, moved differently during the weeks that followed. The Northern dispute's peaceful resolution had produced effects that rippled outward through Lycan politics in ways that were still being felt. Alliances shifted. The Southern faction that Vrail had been connected to was exposed and in disarray. The Northern clan elders, newly represented and newly heard, were invested in the High King's continued stability in a way they had never been. And within the keep itself, something had changed. It was subtle, the kind of subtle that only someone with a sight attuned to emotional weather would notice at first. But Nara noticed it, a shift in how the household staff moved through their days, something less contracted about the collective atmosphere, as if something that had been held under pressure had been, partially, released. She thought about that. She thought about what it would mean if the change she had already catalyzed, the tether bond functioning as it was meant to, a high king who had spent 2 years being quietly, honestly challenged, was made formal. What it would mean for the wolves in the servant quarter who had been doing their excellent, invisible work for years. What it would mean for the Omegas in every Lycan pack across the territory, who lived their whole lives inside the verdict that their birth rank delivered. She was not naive enough to think one decision changed a system. She was not defeated enough to think it didn't matter. The war circle moment happened before she had finished working through the decision. It was a crisis, the kind that didn't wait for decisions to be made at a convenient pace. 3 of the southern faction's military wolves, their exposure nearly complete and their options narrowing, made a preemptive move. They arrived at the outer keep with a significant force, not enough to take the keep, but enough to create chaos, to force a rapid military response, to potentially use the confusion to eliminate certain key figures before the full treason investigation reached them. The keep's war response activated immediately. Cormith was in the central war circle, the large inner courtyard used for rapid military assembly, with his senior commanders and 200 soldiers managing the defensive response. The situation was controlled. The threat, to a professional assessment, was contained. But Nara, from across the keep, felt something through the tether bond that nobody in the war circle could feel. Not the external threat. That was manageable. The pressure she felt was coming from inside the war circle. One of Cormith's senior commanders, not Darrow, who was solid and loyal, but Prent, the second commander, whose loyalty investigation had not yet been completed. She felt him the way she felt all deception when her sight was fully engaged, a wrongness, a misalignment between surface and depth. His positioning within the circle, the specific angle of his attention, the way his hand rested too casually near the ceremonial blade at his side. This was not a defense against external forces. This was a setup. The confusion outside was a distraction. The real target was inside the circle. She was running before she had decided to run. She came through the war circle entrance barefoot. She had been in the library. She had kicked her shoes off as she always did, with the dust of the keep's corridors on her feet and blood on her hands from where she had caught herself on the door latch in her haste. 200 Lycan soldiers. Every one of them turned to look at her. She walked to the center of the circle. She could feel Cormith's eyes on her, the tether bond sharp and immediate, his attention fully focused. She could feel Prent on her left, his wrongness spiking as she entered, the calculation of a man reassessing a situation. She looked at Prent. The sight hit her full force, not a vague impression but a full clear reading, as sharp as text on a page, as certain as translated words resolving from a dead script. His position in the courtyard, the blade, the specific moment he had been waiting for. She looked at him long enough for him to know she knew. His hand moved toward the blade. "You will stop this. Now." Her voice was quiet. It was not the shout of command, not the bark of military authority. It was something older than that. Something that came from the same place as the old script, the same place as the tether bond, the same place that the old texts had been trying to describe when they wrote about authority that was not the product of rank, but of something more fundamental. The entire war circle stopped. Prent's hand stopped. And Cormith, the 43rd Lycan High King, who had not bowed to anyone in his rule, and whose father had not bowed in his, who had been described in the Keep's historical records as the most physically powerful Lycan in the territory, turned to face her fully. He looked at her for a moment. At the bare feet, the blood on her hands, the dark eyes that in this light, the pale combat lantern light of the war circle, showed exactly what they always showed in certain lights, something that had no name in the modern wolf language. And he bent his head, not the nod of acknowledgement, not the slight inclination of a powerful man conceding a point. He bowed. The silence in the war circle was total. Darrow moved first. He had been watching print, as the professionals among them had been watching print, and when Nara's intervention broke the moment, Darrow moved with the speed of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. Print was restrained before he could recover his calculation. The external threat was neutralized within the hour. The Southern faction's military force, without the internal coordination they had been counting on, fell apart quickly. The war circle cleared, and Nara stood in the center of it, breathing carefully, the sight still vibrating through her from the full deployment of it, and watched Cormith walk toward her. He stopped close enough that the tether bond, which had been at full tension from the moment she entered the circle, a bowstring pulled taut, settled back into its deep, warm, structural pressure. "You felt it," he said. "Yes." From across the keep. "The bond is useful for more than politics and library conversations," she said. Something crossed his face. The thing she had seen in the library, in fragments. The full, unguarded thing, the man behind the king's architecture. He reached out and took her hand, the one with blood from the door latch, and turned it over carefully. Looked at the cut. Not deep. The cut of someone who had been moving too fast to be careful. "You came running," he said. "I wasn't going to walk." He was quiet for a moment, still holding her hand. "I need to ask you something." "Ask. Have you finished working through it?" She looked at him. The war circle around them was emptying, the last soldiers filing out with the purposeful efficiency of wolves who understood they were clearing a space that needed to be clear. The combat lanterns guttered in the cold air. Somewhere outside the walls, the sounds of the external response were winding down. It was very quiet. "Yes," she said. What came after was not simple. She had promised him it wouldn't be, and she was right. The formal announcement of Nara's position, High Consort, the title the old texts used for the tether, the one that carried both the personal and the constitutional significance of what the bond meant, was met with exactly the range of responses she had predicted. Shock from the general court, which had noticed the omega of the household as little as everyone else had, and was now in the process of recalibrating with varying degrees of grace. Genuine outrage from the old guard court officials, who found both the rank disruption and the constitutional implications of the tether's formalization deeply threatening to the system they had spent their careers inhabiting. The most direct confrontation came from a court official named Thraidvel, senior minister of rank, a man whose entire career had been built around the maintenance and enforcement of the Lycan hierarchy's formal structure. He requested a private audience with Cormith 48 hours after the announcement, and Cormith granted it. Nara was present. This was Cormith's decision, a deliberate one, made after a brief conversation with Nara in which she had said simply, "If the concern is about me, I should be in the room," and he had said, "Yes," without the hesitation that would have told her it was the reluctant choice rather than the genuine one. Thraidvel walked into the meeting room, saw Nara seated at the table, and went very still. "This is a private audience," he said. "She is present at my request," Cormith said. "Proceed." Thraidvel was a man of 60, gray-haired, and imposing in the specific way of someone who has wielded institutional authority for long enough that their body has taken its shape. He looked at Nara with an expression she recognized. Not contempt. Exactly, because contempt would have required acknowledging her as a threat, and he had not gotten there yet. It was the expression of someone who had not yet accepted that an omega in this room was something that required his direct engagement. He addressed Cormith. He spoke for several minutes about tradition, about rank structure, about the destabilizing implications of elevating an omega to a formal constitutional role, about the precedent it set across the 5 Lycan territories, about the challenges it would create in courts that had been operating under a specific understanding of the hierarchy for generations. It was not an unintelligent argument. When he finished, Cormith looked at Nara. "The floor is yours," he said. Thraidvel turned to look at her then. Finally, fully, with the complete attention of a man who has just been told that the floor is hers and has realized, slightly too late, that he perhaps should have been paying attention earlier. Nara looked at him. She had read everything in the Keep's library about the rank ministry, its history, its original function, the way its mandate had shifted over generations from the documentation of hierarchy to the active enforcement of it. She had read Thraidvel's own written opinions, 3 separate formal papers he had submitted to the court record on the subject of Omega status and the appropriate limits thereof. She was very well prepared. She did not raise her voice. She addressed every point he had made, methodically, with the precision of someone who has been translating complex texts long enough that imprecise language is physically uncomfortable, and who has read more primary source material on the history of the very tradition he was defending than he had. She also told him something he didn't know. The original mandate of the rank ministry, the actual mandate, from the founding document that Thraidvel had clearly never read in its original form, because it had been in a restricted section to which he did not have access, did not describe the ministry's function as enforcement. It described it as record. The rank ministry was created to record the hierarchy as it existed, not to enforce it, not to protect it from change, to document it accurately as it shifted and evolved over time. Your ministry, she said, was created to write down the truth of what the hierarchy is, not to determine what it should be. A pause. The truth right now is that the tether bond has manifested. Your ministry's job is to record that accurately. The original document doesn't give it the authority to do anything else. Thraidvel was very quiet. He left the meeting without further argument. He never directly challenged the position again. And from a smaller number of wolves in the Keep and beyond, from Omegas and low-rank Lycans who had been living their verdict for their entire lives, who heard the news through the rapid, specific communication network that the invisible maintain among themselves, something much harder to articulate, but much more important. Hope is the wrong word for it. It was more specific than hope. It was the particular feeling of watching someone who looks like you, who started where you started, stand in a place you were told you could never stand, and having the evidence of that change the internal story you had been living with for so long, you had stopped noticing you were living it. The Omega who had brought Nara her first week's assignments, a small, quiet woman named Bray who had been at the Keep for 12 years and who had never, in all that time, allowed herself to look directly at anyone ranked above a senior household wolf, sat down in the servant quarter common room on the evening of the announcement and was very still for a long time. She wasn't crying. She wasn't talking. She was just sitting with something. When one of the younger Omegas asked her what she was thinking, Bray was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking," she said at last, "that I should have read more." It was the most personal thing she had said in 12 years at the Keep. That night, she asked Nara how to find the library. Nara went back to her mother's village. Not immediately. There was too much to manage immediately. But 3 months after the formal announcement, she went. Cormath came with her. 2 of Darrow's people for security, traveling quietly, without the full ceremonial escort that a formal visit would have required. The road to the village took 2 days by the mountain route, a long, winding descent through pine-covered slopes that smelled, in the late spring, like every childhood morning she had been away from for 6 years. She had forgotten, or tried to forget, how precise memory was about smell. Every bend in the road brought something back. The specific quality of the air at altitude, the way the light fell through pine canopy, the sound of the creek that ran alongside the lower road for the last 3 miles before the village. She had not let herself think about this route for a very long time. She thought about it now, fully, letting herself, the cottage, her mother's hands, Pell's laugh before it dropped into a young man's register. All of it. The homesickness she had packed down so carefully and so completely that she had almost succeeded in convincing herself it wasn't there. She let it be there. She had learned, over 2 years of conversations in a library, that the things you pack down carefully do not disappear. They just become load-bearing. And load-bearing things require attention. The stone cottage still smelled like wood smoke and dried thyme. Her mother stood in the doorway for a long moment when she saw Nara coming up the path, and then she sat down on the front step and put her face in her hands and cried in the specific way of a woman who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. Nara sat beside her and held her until it passed. She did not cry. She held her mother and felt the specific weight of her, smaller than memory, older than memory, and felt something settle in her bones that had been unsettled for 6 years. Pell came out from the inside of the cottage. He was 20 now, taller than she had expected, with her same dark eyes and their mother's way of standing, and he looked at his sister with the complicated expression of a young man who felt guilt and joy in equal measure and didn't know which one to lead with. He had built a life while she was away. She could see it in him, the confidence of someone who had figured out how to occupy his place in the world, and the shadow of guilt that lived alongside that confidence. Because figuring out how to occupy your place is easier when you haven't been watching someone who loves you be absent from theirs. She made it easy for him. She reached out and pulled him into a hug before he could decide. "I don't blame you for the letters stopping," she said, into his shoulder. "I need you to hear that." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have kept writing. You were building a life. That's what you were supposed to do." She stepped back and looked at him. "Tell me about it." "All of it," he told her. They were in the small kitchen for 3 hours before Cormith's name came up. Not because she was hiding him, but because there was simply that much of Pell's life to cover, and she listened to every word of it with the full attention that had always been her truest gift, the attention that made people feel, correctly, that they were being genuinely heard. Her mother watched from across the table, saying little, doing the thing she had always done, the careful, comprehensive reading of a person that she had, apparently, passed to her daughter. Later, when Pell had finally exhausted his 3 years of news and was sitting back with the satisfied expression of someone who has been thoroughly listened to, his eyes moved to where Cormith stood at the kitchen's far end, patient and quiet, eating the bread their mother had put in front of him with no ceremony and no comment. Pell looked at Nara. She looked back. "That's him," Pell said. "Yes." A pause. "He traveled 2 days to come to our cottage." "Yes." Another pause. "He's eating Mam's bread." "He is." Pell was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "Is he good to you?" The directness of it, the specific, uncomplicated protectiveness of a younger brother who has been away but not absent, made something warm move through her chest. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. "He is." Cormith came with her. 2 of Darrow's people for security, traveling quietly, without the full ceremonial escort that a formal visit would have required. Later, when her mother had recovered herself and Pell had produced food with the particular energy of someone who needed something practical to do, and the 4 of them sat in the small kitchen with the fire going and the smell of the thyme her mother kept in bundles above the window. Cormith sat across from Nara's mother and answered every question the older woman asked him with the full honesty that Nara had spent 2 years demanding of him and that he had, gradually, learned to extend to. More of his life. Her mother's questions were not diplomatic. She asked what his intentions were. She asked what provision had been made for Nara's autonomy within the keep's formal structure. She asked, with the directness of a woman who had raised her daughter in difficult circumstances and had not done so in order to see her exchanged for a different kind of confinement, what would happen if Nara decided she did not want the position anymore? Cormith answered all of it. Nara watched her mother's face as he talked, watched the evaluation happening, the steady assessment of a woman measuring a man against an internal standard that no amount of kingship was going to impress on its own. At the end, her mother looked at Nara. "He talks straight," she said. "He does," Nara agreed. "He didn't always." It's been a project. Cormath, across the table, said nothing, but the expression on his face was the one she had come to recognize as the nearest he got to self-deprecating acknowledgement. Her mother looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, the same way Elder Vajja had nodded at a different story in a different place, the nod of an elder confirming something that has been examined and found sound. The constitutional formalization of the Tether took 2 years to complete. Not the announcement. That was immediate. The actual legal architecture, the insertion of the old law back into the active Lycan code, the establishment of what the Tether's role meant in practical governance, the protections it carried, all of that required the careful, methodical work of people who knew both the old texts and the current law well enough to bridge them. Nara did most of the bridging herself. In the process, she spent more time with Quist than she had in 6 years of unauthorized library visits. Now officially, formally, with a title that made the old librarian's ancient eyes crinkle at the corners every time she walked in. He had known, she realized. Not everything. But he had known she was reading the restricted text from approximately the 3rd month. He had known and chosen, for 6 years, to leave the relevant sections exactly where she could find them. Why? She asked him once directly. He thought about it. Because the texts were doing what they were meant to do, he said. They were being read by someone who needed them. I see no reason to interfere with that. I was an Omega household worker accessing restricted materials. You were the most attentive reader I have had in 40 years of librarianship, he said. Rank is not what makes a reader. She thought about that for a long time. The final version of the restored Tether law was, in Nara's estimation, better than the original. More precise. More explicit about what the role meant in practical terms. It included language that had not been in the ancient version. Language about the Tether's right to information, the Tether's standing in court decisions, and a specific provision that the old scholars, writing in a world they couldn't fully imagine, had never needed to include. That the Tether's rank was not hereditary, not transferable, and not determined by birth status. It was determined by the bond. The bond did not consult the hierarchy. The bond chose who it chose. That provision was, by far, the most controversial. 3 court officials submitted formal objections. 2 of those objections were substantive enough to require detailed written responses, which Nara drafted herself, in the careful, methodical language of someone who had spent years translating complex ideas from one framework into another. The 3rd objection came from Thraidvel. He submitted it in writing, formally, through official channels, and it was dense and careful and legally sophisticated. Nara read it twice. Then she drafted a response twice as long, twice as dense, and 3 times as legally precise, drawing entirely from primary sources that predated his objection's foundational premise by 200 years. Thraidvel did not submit a counter-response. She had come to understand, over the months since their meeting, that he was not an evil man. He was a man who had built his professional identity so completely around a particular structure that any change to that structure felt like a personal attack. His objections were not malicious. They were frightened. She addressed the fear in her written response, directly and without condescension, acknowledging what the change genuinely cost people who had organized their understanding of the world around a specific set of rules, and explaining, with the same clarity she brought to everything, why the cost was worth bearing. He never thanked her for that. But 3 months later, at a court session she attended in her formal capacity, she caught him looking at her, not with the veiled dismissal of their first meeting, but with the specific expression of a man who is in the process of revising something and hasn't finished, but is farther along than he was. She nodded to him. He nodded back. It was, she thought, a beginning. The year after the recognition ceremony was the most consequential of Nara's time at the Keep, not in terms of dramatic events, but in terms of the slower, more durable kind of change that happens when a truth has been formally established and the world begins, reluctantly, and then more willingly, to reorganize itself around it. 3 Omegas from the Keep's household staff requested access to the library's general collection. Not the restricted section, just the general collection, the one that had technically been available to them, but had never in practice been made genuinely accessible. Nara ensured the access was formalized. 2 of those 3 Omegas were still reading, 3 years later, in the warm early evenings when the day's work was done. A clan from the mid-territories sent a formal inquiry to the Keep about the Tether law, specifically, whether the legal protections extended to rank status in their own territory's Omega population or only to the specific role. That inquiry prompted a 3-month legal examination that resulted in a significant expansion of the law's scope. And Pell wrote, regularly, consistently, the way he had in the years before the letters stopped. He wrote about the village, about his work, about a girl he had met at the spring gathering whose name was Cress, and who was, he wrote, the most opinionated person he had ever encountered, and he found this extremely attractive. He wrote about their mother, who had apparently taken Cormutha's visit as definitive evidence that her opinion of him was correct, and had begun referring to him in her letters as your man, with a warmth that made Nara smile every time. She wrote back, every time, without exception. She was aware, writing those letters, of how different the act of writing them felt now from the letters she had written in the first years at the Keep. Careful, abbreviated, edited down to what was safe to say, shielding her real interior life from the paper as thoroughly as she shielded it from the people around her. These letters were full. She told Pell things, real things, about the cases she worked on, the arguments she had made, the moments that were difficult and the moments that were extraordinary, the quiet late evenings in the library with old Quist, and the less quiet late evenings arguing with Cormuth about the eastern border policy over the remains of a meal they had both forgotten to finish. She wrote once about the war circle night, the barefoot sprint, the blood, the moment she had looked at Prent and said the old word, and the hall had gone silent. Pell's response to that letter was 4 words long. That's my sister. Yes. She folded that letter and kept it under the loose stone beneath her cot, the same stone under which she had once kept her notebook of documented thefts, now repurposed for the keeping of things that mattered, and thought that there was something right about that continuity. The same hiding place. Different things worth hiding. Things worth keeping. Now, not because they were dangerous to show, but because they were precious. Because she had learned, finally and fully, the difference. There is something the oldest Lycan texts say, not the ones about power, not the ones about war, not the ones about the complicated mechanisms of hierarchy that wolves had been building and defending and killing for over centuries. The oldest of all the old texts, the one that predated all the others, the one that Nara had found in the deepest restricted section on a night in her 5th year at the Keep, when she had finally gained access to the sealed section that Quist had been protecting not from her, but for her, waiting until she was ready. That text said this, not a coronation. The Tether had never been crowned. The old texts were clear that the role did not work that way, and Nara had been specific with the court officials about honoring the original form. But a recognition ceremony, drawn from the oldest Lycan traditions, the ones that predated the Keep itself. In the weeks leading up to it, Nara had prepared not through the activities the court expected. She had declined the formal wardrobe consultation, the protocol rehearsals, the endless meetings with court officials who wanted to script and choreograph every moment of it. But in the way she had always prepared for anything that mattered, by understanding it fully. She had read every account of every recognition ceremony in the Keep's records. There had been 4 in the Keep's documented history, and each one was different, because the Tether was different each time, and the bond was different, and the specific truth of what was being recognized was different. She made one request to the ceremony's organizers. She wanted to read the old text herself, in the original script, during the ceremony, not have it read by the officiating elder, but read it herself. In the old language. The way it was meant to be spoken, by the person who had spent the most time with it. The officiating elder, an ancient wolf named Cray who had been doing ceremony work for 40 years and who had, in his long career, developed strong opinions about traditional forms, looked at her for a moment. "Can you read it with the proper intonation?" he asked. "I have been reading it for 6 years," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "Yes, then," he said, and went back to his preparations. The entire court was present. Every rank, every role, including the household staff, including the Omegas, who stood in the back and on the edges as they always did, invisible by habit and by expectation. The ceremonial hall was the largest space in Ashfeld Keep, a vast stone room with high arched ceilings that had been designed, for centuries ago, to hold the full assembly of the Lycan court at moments of historical significance. It had been used perhaps a dozen times in recorded history for its intended purpose. Today it was full in a way it rarely was. Not just the official court, not just the ranked wolves, but the household staff, the kitchen workers, the Omega cleaning staff, the young wolves who had been at the keep for 2 years and not yet found any reason to believe they were part of anything larger than their assigned duties. They were here, all of them, because someone had quietly ensured that the ceremony was open to the full household, and that the full household knew it. That someone was Bray, the small, quiet Omega who had been at the keep for 12 years and had recently, with some assistance in finding the relevant section, begun reading in the library. Old Quist, sitting in the front row with the slightly beatific expression of a scholar watching something he had been hoping to live long enough to see, caught Nara's eye as she walked to the center of the hall. He nodded, once, with the specific satisfaction of a librarian whose restricted section has, finally, been used for exactly the purpose it was intended for. Cormith stood at the center of the ceremonial hall. The elder who officiated read from the old text, the real one, in the original script, the one Nara had translated in a library at midnight barefoot on the cold floor. The elder's reading was careful and formal, but the words themselves carried their original weight, the weight of things written down by people who understood that some truths needed to be put in language and held there, because the world would keep trying to forget them. Nara stood across from him. In 6 years at the keep, she had never stood at the center of anything. She stood there now, and she read the old words in the old language, and her voice was steady, not loud, not performing, just present, the way she had always been present in the places where the truth lived. At the moment the old text required, Cormith bent his head. Not for the cameras, not for the court, not for the political symbolism of what it represented, though it was all of those things. For her. For 2 years of library conversations and real questions and honest challenges. For the night, she ran barefoot with blood on her hands because the tether told her to move. For every word she had translated in the dark and brought into the light. For the specific, undramatic, life-changing courage of a woman who had been invisible for 6 years and had spent that time understanding everything, and had finally been seen. When he raised his head, she was looking at him. The hall behind her. She felt it without turning around. The sight reading the room the way it always did, was completely silent. And then, from the back of the hall, from somewhere among the household staff, among the Omegas standing at the edges with their invisible habit posture, a sound. One wolf applauding. Bray. And then another, the young Omega who had asked her what she was thinking the evening of the announcement. And then the sound spread forward through the hall like a wave moving toward a shore, and by the time it reached the front rows, the court officials, the ranked wolves, the people who had the most complicated feelings about what this day meant, it was already too large to be anything other than what it was. Unanimous. Nara looked at the hall full of people making that sound. She thought of her mother's cottage. She thought of the narrow cot in the servant quarter, and 6 years of early mornings and cold corridors, and doing excellent work in rooms full of people who looked through her. She thought of the night she had opened a book in a dead script and felt the characters resolve into meaning. She thought of a floor between two bookshelves and a man who sat down across from her and asked a real question. She did not cry. She was not a crier, as a rule. But something in her chest, something that had been held at a specific tension for a very long time. Not the pact bond and not the tether bond, but something more personal and less nameable. The tension of a person who has been waiting to be allowed to take up the space they were always meant to take up. That thing finally, fully, released. She stood in the center of the ceremonial hall. Not at the edge. Not at the back. At the center. Where she had always belonged. There is something the oldest Lycan texts say. Not the ones about power. Not the ones about war. Not the ones about the complicated mechanisms of hierarchy that wolves had been building and defending and killing for over centuries. The oldest of all the old texts, the one that predated all the others, the one that Nara had found in the deepest restricted section on a night in her 5th year at the keep, when she had finally gained access to the sealed section that Quist had been protecting not from her, but for her, waiting until she was ready. That text said this: "The great mistake of the powerful is to believe that strength flows downward, that it lives at the top of the structure and filters, diluted, toward the base. But the truth, which power does not want to know, is that strength lives at the root. It lives in the ones who carry without recognition, who hold without being held, who know without being asked. The structure does not grant them strength. They grant the structure its." Nara had read that passage 3 times on the night she found it. She had sat with it for a long time. She was still sitting with it, in a way, still turning it over, still finding new things in it, in the way that true things keep revealing themselves the longer you hold them. She had not been weak. She had never been weak. She had been a root, called a nothing, living in the dark where roots live, doing the essential, invisible work of holding everything up. And when the light finally found her, she had already been there for years. If you made it to the end of this story, you are not the same person you were at the beginning of it. That's the sign that a story did what it was supposed to do. Nara Osk was told she was weak her whole life. And she showed up anyway. She showed up to the library, and the war circle, and the stone cottage in the village, and the center of the ceremonial hall. She showed up, quietly, completely, without performance, until the world had no choice but to see her. This channel exists for everyone who has ever been in the back of the room when they should have been in the center. Every week, we tell stories about wolves who were underestimated, loves that found each other in the dark, power that surprised everyone, including itself. We tell stories that remind you what you are when the world keeps trying to tell you otherwise. If this story found you, it found you for a reason. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Leave your location in the comments. I want to know where in the world someone needed to hear this today. Because someone did. Maybe it was you. The next story is already waiting. And if you are anything like Nara Osk, and I think you might be, you will want to be here when it begins.